Hello, my name is Dr. Anthony Cliff, and today we're talking about hypothesis and why you need one for statistical tests and how to go about creating one. So, as we're using questionnaires as on the positivistic scale of research, we often believe that there's one truth and we set out to find that truth. Unlike a qualitative kind of interview where you generate data and to try and find a hypothesis, we're going to make a hypothesis, we're going to test it and see if that's true or false. Okay, so a hypothesis can be described as a tentative explanation for an observation, phenomenon or scientific problem that can be tested by further investigation. Okay, and is a stepping stone to soon to be proven theory. Okay, and that is what you do, that's why you're doing a questionnaire. You're setting out to find a truth in a particular area. Okay, so that is a hypothesis. But before we discuss hypothesis, we need to understand and make sure that you understand the difference in variables in terms of independent and dependent, because we're going to use them as our basis to form a hypothesis. So what is an independent variable then? Well, an independent variable is simply a variable that is not affected by something else, okay? Or can be described as the cause. So, for example, a person's age isn't influenced by their attitudes towards flooding. Okay, so that's an independent variable. However, their attitude towards flooding may be influenced by their age, being a dependent variable. You can often think of it as, in an experiment, the thing that you control, the thing that you know about, the thing that you can quantify. So, for example, gender, age, education, and income. Okay. So regardless of what question you ask them, they're always going to be male, or they're always going to be 25, or they're always going to have a GCSE. It's the independent variable. On the other hand, a dependent variable is something that is affected by something else. So as I mentioned before, while their age is independent and is not influenced by their attitudes towards flooding, their attitudes towards flooding, a dependent variable, can be influenced by their age. Okay? So the dependent variable is the condition that you are measuring in an experiment. You're assessing how it responds to a change in the independent variable. So you can think of it as depending on the independent variable. And often that is attitudes, responses, and beliefs are dependent variables. So, to get your head around this, here's some examples for you to identify. Are males more likely to be flood aware than females? So in this case, the independent variable is males and females because that's gender. But their flood awareness is a dependent variable because that may change depending on what gender they sit in. Does property ownership increase the level of flood prevention methods in the home? Well, property ownership is an independent variable and their flood prevention methods is a dependent variable. Because if you own a house, you're probably more likely to be protective of it than if you had a landlord, for example. And a household with more than 2 persons are more likely to have a flood plan. It's a bit more of a tricky one, but here the 2 persons is the independent variable and the likelihood of having a flood plan is a dependent variable. So now that we know the difference between an independent and a dependent variable, we now need to form our hypothesis. Okay, and a hypothesis is a statement that we're going to find a truth in a particular area. Okay. So for example, using the example before, we could say as a hypothesis that low educational attainment decreases flood preparedness in adults. So this statement is called a simple hypothesis, where you state that one variable will affect the other. So for example here, I'm stating that low educational attainment, so an independent variable, education level, will decreases flood preparedness in adults. So flood preparedness being the dependent variable. So I'm simply stating that one will affect the other, and I suggest here that, for example, I imagine if you're lower educated, that you may have a lower preparedness than compared to highly educated people. So that's a simple hypothesis. An independent is affecting a dependent in either direction, increase or decrease. So that is fine, and that's what we'll use. However, for any statistical tests, it runs on the null hypothesis. So what is the null hypothesis then? Well, the null hypothesis is a statement of no relationship between two variables, i.e. the independent variable does not influence the dependent variable. And we must always state the null hypothesis when conducting statistical tests, as this is the assumption that all statistical tests run off. Statistical tests don't aim to prove there is a relationship. Instead, they aim to disprove that there isn't a relationship. Okay? So, as you can imagine, SPSS and the tests, they don't know what you're looking for. They don't know if you're looking, for example, before that low educational decreases flood preparedness. What they're actually looking for is that the level of attainment doesn't influence the level of flood preparedness in adults at all. So the reason that we do this is because if it's found that there is an influence, we can reject the null hypothesis. So then we know that it does influence it, and then we can go back to our original hypothesis, or what we would call the alternative hypothesis, and see if that's true or not. And that's something we're going to discuss more when we do our tests in SPSS. So some key points to consider then. You need to make sure you know your variables and define them clearly, and focus on cause and effect. Be precise in writing your hypothesis clearly and concisely, and make sure that they're testable. Make sure that it's something that you can actually test.